Hello, friends. Today's podcast question is short and sweet. It says, how can I cultivate a peaceful learning environment at home? Now, initially, you may think that this only applies to homeschooling families, and it certainly does. However, even if you are a parent who sends your child to public or private school, this can still apply to you as well. That it's important as Christians that we make our homes places that are conducive for our children to learn. And as Christians, this is important for us to do because God designed us to learn more about the world around us. You know, we are called in the first chapter of Genesis to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. And filling the earth and subduing it, part of that involves learning more about the world around us and learning how we can better steward it. It's also important as Christians because we want our children to be lifelong learners. We don't want them to be hoop jumpers who just, jump through hoops to complete an assignment and jump to the next grade level. We want to cultivate in them a love for learning. And we also want to help them cultivate the skills that they need to seek God through His Word. So no matter the educational setting that your child is in, it's so important that we make our homes places that are conducive to learning. So that's the question we're going to dive down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for this episode today. And before we dive down into these tips, if you've been blessed by the Foundation Worldview podcast in the past, just ask that you would invest the few seconds that it takes to like and subscribe and rate and review this content. It helps you out, making sure you don't miss any future episodes, and it helps us out, making sure that this episode appears in other people's feeds. Now, when we're thinking about cultivating an environment conducive to learning, I think that there's 4 key things that we can do in our homes. The first thing might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it is so important. The first thing is we need to provide plenty of opportunities for free play. That so much of the learning that we do as children takes place during unstructured times. So make sure that whether you are a homeschooling family, a private schooling family, a public schooling family, that your children have plenty of time for free play. Recently, a friend reached out to me and said that she was feeling kind of discouraged because her children, who she homeschools, that they would always want to get through with their lessons quickly so that they could get back to playing. And now I was encouraging her saying, you're wise to make sure that they get through their lessons, that they do need to get through those. But in this stage of childhood, that free play is so important, that our children are learning so many different skills as they are using their imagination, as they're using their creativity, as they're just exploring the world around them. So if you don't currently do this, I would really encourage you to have lots of outside time. Make sure that your backyard, if you have one, is a place where your children can run and jump and explore. Make use of the different public parks in your area so that your kids can explore nature, take use of the different playgrounds, all of those things. And then as your children are growing, gradually release more responsibility to them. That we as parents shouldn't always constantly be monitoring our children, because they need to learn that they are growing and that they can take different risks, that they can learn to handle conflicts and problems, without us having to jump in every single time. So we want our children to really be able to view the world as their classroom, to just really foster a love of learning. So first, just make sure that you're including plenty of time for free play. Yet we know that when it comes to schoolwork, whether that be work that's being done in a homeschool or homework that's being done at home, that the environment in our home should be conducive to schoolwork learning as well. So the second step that I recommend you take is place certain boundaries around the space where your children will do their schoolwork, whether that schoolwork is their homeschool work or their homework from school. And so I recommend that you either have a space that is solely devoted to learning, or have something different in that space that signals to your child's body that they should be in learning mode. So if you have a separate space, let's say, you have an office space, or you're homeschooling, you have a homeschool room. One thing that's really important is that you only use that space for schoolwork or homework. And when you only use that space for schoolwork or homework, that helps trigger in your child's body, okay, this is learning time. I think of myself right now as I'm recording this podcast, I am in my home office, and I just set limits around this office, that the only things I do in this office are related to work. In fact, on Sundays, I do not allow myself to step foot in this office because Sundays are my Sabbath and I am resting from work. So I don't even allow myself to step in this room on Sundays. So when we make sure that the space is just for schoolwork or homework, this is going to help trigger in your child's brain every time they enter that room that it's time to focus and learn when they are in that space. Now, you may be thinking, oh, well, that sounds wonderful, Elizabeth, but we do not have an extra room that we can just solely devote to schoolwork or to homework. And I get that. That might not be possible for you. Now, if that is not possible, what you can do is you can do certain things in that space when your child is going to do their schoolwork or their homework that are going to signal to your child's body that something is different when they're in this space. I think again of my home office. Before I lived in this house, I lived just outside of Chicago and I shared a home with two other roommates. And my office in that house was either in a common living space or it was in my bedroom. And so I wanted to make sure that my bedroom or this common living space didn't always become like a workplace for me. So what I would do when my desk was in one of those two areas is every time I was in that space working, I would put on a set of indoor shoes. So I had sneakers that only stayed in the house, so they weren't tracking dirt all over the house. But I put those sneakers on to signal to my body, Elizabeth, you are at work. And so that was really helpful. So then when I came in my bedroom, when it was time to go to sleep or when I was just relaxing, my body didn't automatically enter into work mode because I didn't have those sneakers on. So my body just, automatically knew like, you're not working right now. So what you could do is you could have a certain chair that your child uses every time they're doing their schoolwork and their homework. And this chair could only be used during schoolwork or homework times. You could do the same thing that I did, buy your child a pair of indoor shoes that are not allowed to go outside. And every time your child is doing schoolwork or homework, that they're wearing that pair of indoor shoes. So that's signaling to their body, to their brain, something is different. I'm not just relaxing or playing at home right now. I'm seated and I'm working. Something else you could do is, buy them a school sweater, a sweater that they only use when they're doing homeschool work or when they're doing after school homework. Just something that is going to trigger in their minds, this is different. When I was teaching fourth grade, my first year of teaching, I taught science to all three sections of the fourth graders. And what I would do is I wanted my students to be in like scientific mode. When they were in science class, I wanted them to be discovering and to be looking at different things. So I just went to the dollar store and I bought a whole bunch of reading glasses and I popped out the lenses on all of them. And every time the students came in for science, I would have them put on a pair of these fake glasses, like even if they wore glasses, I'd let them choose, if they wanted to or not. And many of them chose to have two pairs of glasses, they'd have their real glasses on and then they'd have, the scientific glasses. But that was just something to signal to them like, hey, I'm in science class right now. I'm going to be thinking like a scientist. So whether or not you have a space you can devote solely to learning, when it's time to learn, there should be something that triggers in your child's mind, this is time for my academic educational learning, whether it's a schoolroom that they are just entering when they're doing schoolwork or something like a pair of shoes or a special chair or a sweater or something like that. Now, if you have something in your household that kind of signals to your child, this is time to do our schoolwork or our homework that is outside of the guidelines that I have already given, please feel free to write that in the comments on YouTube. Again, as I say in many podcasts, I think just hearing what other people do can be so helpful for getting ideas for our homes. The third thing that I think is important is making sure that the space in which our children are doing their academic learning is conducive to focus. So make sure that there are no distractions. If you have a space that's specifically devoted to learning, there shouldn't be any TVs in there. You shouldn't bring your phone in there. There shouldn't be music playing in there. If the room in which you have your child do their homework, it does have a TV, it should just be the rule that is always off. It is never on during that time. Also, make sure that if you do have a special room that is devoted to your homeschooling or just to academic learning, be careful about how much you have in that room, that it shouldn't be very cluttered, whether we're talking about clutter from the furniture or also just clutter with what you have on the walls. That I know many homeschool families, they like to set it up like a classroom and they have charts and maps and graphs and things like that on the walls. And that can be great, but it's important not to have too much. I'm very much a minimalist in that I get rid of things all the time. I hate clutter. Clutter and disorganization just stresses me out. So when I was a teacher, there were 3 bulletin boards that were set up in my classroom, and there were bulletin boards that we used throughout the whole year. And then I had a Bible timeline in my classroom that we would add different biblical narratives to as we went throughout the year. And that was all that I had up on the walls. And every time one of the special education teachers came into my room, they would just say, "Oh, I am just so grateful for your classroom. Like, it's not overly stimulating, to our children that have struggles learning." And so it's really important that yes, we can have some academic things up, but don't make it like a huge art gallery that's going to distract your children. Also, you want to make sure that it's comfortable. The room is comfortable to be in. I remember that it was probably like my 7th or 8th year of teaching. I did some research on, is there ways that I can make my classroom like just more conducive to learning? And I found 2 things that kind of surprised me. That a couple different studies had found that having natural light in a classroom, that triggers in students like just their brains to be on and active. And so that it was really important that a classroom have natural light and that it also be well lit, that you didn't want darkness, because darkness is the signal to the brain. Okay, now it's time to slow down. It's time to wind down. It's almost time to shut off. So I made sure after I read that, I used to keep the blinds in my classroom open. Just how classroom blinds work. They're kind of like slats, and I just like push them to open. Where after that, I would actually pull them apart so that the windows were fully visible every day. And I made sure that I would always have, the classroom lights on. Another thing that I found is that a couple different studies found that children learned best when the temperature was set to 72 degrees. Now, at the time, I was teaching in a school where I had my own thermostat in the classroom. So I was able to set it to 72 degrees no matter what time of the year. You may be thinking, Elizabeth, we live in northern Montana. Like, my spouse would be so angry if I set it at 72 because our heating bill in the winter would be over $1,000. Okay, so you might not be able to have the ideal temperature in your house. That's fine. You don't need that. Children can learn without that. But just make sure that your child is comfortable. If it's a cold room where your child is learning, make sure that they have a sweatshirt or a blanket, something that's going to keep them warm. If it's really hot and you don't have a lot of air conditioning in the room, make sure there's a fan, something that's going to keep it so that their body's not in a state of trying to figure out how to reach a warmer or lower temperature, but they can focus on learning. Okay, so the first thing we covered was provide plenty of opportunities for free play. Second, place certain boundaries around the space. Third, make that space conducive to focus. And then fourth, be consistent yet wisely offer flexibility. So what I mean by this is be consistent in your expectations. If your expectation is that your child is seated for the entire time during a lesson, make sure that you are consistent with that expectation. If you're okay if they're choosing to be seated or standing, be consistent with that expectation. Just make sure that they know they are expected to focus on their work during that time. Then also think about, especially if you're homeschooling and you're doing schoolwork throughout the whole day or a good portion of the day, or if your child has a lot of homework, think through what movement is healthy and helpful, that children need to move. So if you have a son, boys especially need to move. Girls need to move too, but boys especially need to move. So if you have a son and it takes you about 3 hours to get through your homeschool lesson, your son shouldn't be seated for more than a half hour at a time. Like, he needs to move. Same for your daughter as well, but your son needs it even more. And same if your child has more than a half hour of homework. Expecting them to be seated working on an academic task for more than a half hour just is not realistic. So have different places that they can move. Like maybe while they're doing their work, they can stay seated at the table. Maybe halfway through, they can stand up, but still be doing that. Maybe they can move over, to a rug or a pillow on the floor. I know when I was teaching, One thing I did to just get my students' bodies moving was when I was teaching a lesson, if I was teaching a long lesson, a lesson that was 30 minutes or longer, I would have my students seated at their desk for 10 to 15 minutes. Then I would have them get up and move to a rug that was right at the front of the classroom. I'd teach them there for 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'd have them get up and move back to their desks. And I mean, that wasn't a ton of movement, but what it was is as their bodies were moving, their hearts were working harder to pump the blood through their body because they were moving. Blood carries oxygen. The brain needs oxygen to be awake and to pay attention. And so just by having my students move from their desk to the rug every 10 to 15 minutes helped increase their focus. Then make sure that if you are homeschooling, that you have some times for breaks throughout the day, that your kids do need breaks. Even in school, when I was teaching, my students would have 2 recesses a day, and it would have been even better if they could have had 3. So make sure that there are plenty of times for breaks for them to get up, get their bodies moving. Also, make sure that you incorporate healthy snacks and water. If your child comes home from school and they have, 4 Oreos, that's okay, it's fine if kids have Oreos. I'm not trying to say never let kids have Oreos, but if that's the snack that they're having right before they're about to do their schoolwork, that's not going to be conducive to helping them focus. So make sure that they're having healthy snacks and water. And then the second part of this, first I said be consistent, and then I said yet wisely offer flexibility. Use wisdom in when change might be needed for one day for a different circumstance. If your child is just getting over a cold or the flu, if something really sad happened, and they're really struggling with that, if they've, just been working on a project that's really hard for them and they're feeling frustrated, offer flexibility on those days. You as the parent are the expert on your child. You know them the best. So be wise in keeping consistent expectations, yet offering flexibility. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. If you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of his Son. I'll see you next time.